Back When is sponsored by Seawe, the National Trust's photo printing partner. Every image captures a story. Seawe's support means the National Trust can protect our nation's memories by caring for and sharing our vast collection of historic photographs. Through our work together, we're uncovering precious and previously unseen images for everyone to enjoy. Discover our work snapshotting 200 years of history. Search online for Seawe, that's CEWE, and the National Trust.
It was nighttime when it happens. Many of the men were actually asleep. They were caught in a change of wind, a westerly wind. Within minutes, it had heeled over and started to split. It broke in two. That intensity of emotion of people who suddenly realize that their lives are about to end.
The Lizard Point in Cornwall is known for its hidden coves and blue seas. You'd have no idea that underneath these waves lies a notorious graveyard of ships. And there's one disaster that's especially remembered here because of the scale of lives lost and the strange aftermath. The Royal Anne Galley. Our history is all around us, and I'm transporting you back for the inside story of the people, places, and moments that made us. I'm Helen Antrobus. Lean in for a tale from time, back when. The British Isles are steeped in maritime history. Over the centuries, shipwrecks were part of life and remain imprinted in our culture.
The UK has 50,000 plus shipwrecks around it. There are stretches of coast in the southwest of England which are literally carpeted with shipwrecks from the last 2,000 plus years.
David Gibbins is a marine archaeologist, diver, and author of the book A History of the World in 12 Shipwrecks. David lives in Cornwall, not far from the Lizard Peninsula. The Lizard Point is a beauty spot, but the geology that makes it distinctive has also been the cause of dozens of disasters. But there's one wreck that keeps David up at night. The Royal Anne Galley has lain on the seafloor for 300 years and is still shrouded in mystery. Its story lets us glimpse into 18th century life at sea and a doomed voyage.
The Royal Anne set off in early November 1721, heading towards the Caribbean. She has on board her crew, Captain Willis, who's a typically experienced mariner of that period. She also had on board Lord Belhaven, who was a Scottish peer. He'd just been appointed as governor of Barbados, which at the time was one of the more prosperous of the island colonies in the Caribbean, prospering because of the sugar trade and unfortunately on the back of slavery. What we know about the crew, we know their names, we know their ages. Sailors did often come from poor working class backgrounds. Most of them would have been English, but there were probably a smattering of people from other nations as well. There are wills of the men on the ship that were taken out before they left Portsmouth, which are typical sailors' wills, and they often did that because of the expectation of risk and danger on long voyages. There's one man called Thomas Whaley, and he takes out a will where he talks of his expectation of getting back to the woman he loves and how she's the love of his life. And it's all terribly poignant because you know what's going to happen to him.
So Captain Francis Willis, Lord Belhaven, a handful of dignitaries and the crew, around 210 people on board in total, are ready to set sail for the Caribbean. They're expecting a voyage of around 6 weeks to cover the 4,000 miles across the Atlantic. On board, Captain Willis is under pressure. He has been set a daunting task by the Admiralty. After Willis makes the journey, taking his passengers to Barbados, he and his crew are to hunt down some of the most dangerous outlaws on the seas, the pirates of the Caribbean.
These were the orders for his final voyage. You are to inform yourself whether any piratical ships or vessels are hovering about that government. And if so, you are to proceed in quest of such pirates and use your utmost endeavours to take, sink, burn, or otherwise destroy them. And this is extraordinary because this is right at the time of the height of the pirates of the Caribbean.
But the Royal Anne Galley would not meet her fate fighting pirates. Captain Willis and his crew are unaware the true dangers of their voyage lurk much closer to home. In fact, they'd barely left port when problems started. In the 18th century, shipwrecks are all too common. Galleys like the Royal Anne look like how you might imagine a pirate ship. They're made of wood, propelled with a windsail and rowed with oars. But even if galleys are solidly built, disaster isn't far away. Before modern technological safety advancements, sailors depend on their knowledge of the seas. In this era, people navigate by the stars and use basic compasses. And ships are very vulnerable to human error, hidden rocks, and weather. On the night of the 10th of November, 1721, the Royal Anne Galley has set sail and begins her passage through Lizard Point.
The Lizard Peninsula is like a great sort of slumbering, giant prehistoric creature, and the rocks off the end are like the kind of decayed teeth sticking out of the sea. The tides at a certain point come at the same time, so you get the ebb and the flow hitting each other and causing eddies and whirlpools. Just absolutely lethal water conditions.
Unfortunately for the crew of the Royal Anne, as they pass Lizard Point, a storm is blowing in.
It was nighttime when it happens. Many of the men were actually asleep. They were caught in a change of wind, a westerly wind.
The crew realise they need to turn back, but it's too late.
The ship was blown into this terrifying rock called Man o' War, which juts out from the southwestern side of the rocks off the peninsula. Within minutes, it had heeled over and started to split. It broke in two and very, very quickly dispersed as flotsam and jetsam, and most of the crew as well. Very few of whom probably would have been able to swim, and even if you had been able to swim, the chances of survival would be very small.
As the Royal Anne crashes violently, hundreds of men are trapped, dragged underwater, or tossed against jagged rocks. Their homeland is in their sights, but out of reach.
They were a stone's throw from the wreck site to the shore.
In just a few hours, the Royal Anne Galley is catastrophically smashed against rocks and sinks just meters from the shore. By the morning light, of around 210 people on board, there are only 3 survivors, all local men. One of them clinging to a rock all night. Everyone else, Captain Willis, the dignitaries and crew, are all dead. After a shipwreck in the 18th century, communities lament the tragedy. People are especially affected by the idea of lost souls or unknown bodies washed up who can't be buried properly in church grounds. And then there are the practicalities after a wreck. Wreckers are scavengers who loot a lost ship. Local builders might use wood from shipwrecks to build houses, and other members of the community, like the clergy, might be expected to pick bodies and even body parts along the coast. In the case of the Royal Anne, it's the aftermath of the wreck where things take a strange and eerie turn.
There's a local legend that many of the bodies were brought up and buried in mass graves in a place called Pistol Meadow.
Pistol Meadow is today enjoyed as a beauty spot along the coastal path. But for many years, people avoided going there at night, reporting strange happenings. There are sightings of a ghostly figure in a three-point sailor's hat roaming the coastline, and reports of dogs acting strangely, linked to a gruesome belief that dogs had savaged some of the bodies that washed ashore.
If you do the coast path walk at Lizard Point, it's a slightly haunting place to be in, especially at night when it's misty. Even now on the Lizard, you speak to fishermen and people whose families have been here for generations, and they remember all this.
The 300-year-old mystery of whether Pistol Meadow is the spot where hundreds of bodies from the Royal Anne are buried in unmarked graves isn't just a fisherman's tale. Some experts are so convinced by the legend that in 2015, the National Trust and the Maritime Archaeology Sea Trust help organise an excavation of the meadow to try and find the missing bodies.
And no bodies were found, but the excavation was only possible in a fairly limited part of the meadow. It is actually still very possible that there are bodies there, but they were never discovered. So what was already a kind of mystery continues to be so.
David Gibbins is one of the few people to have visited the Royal Anne wreck. He has to wait for the perfect conditions, as it's still a treacherous stretch of water for divers.
My most memorable dive on the Royal Anne was the very first one I did. I decided to take the plunge, went down and pulled myself down through this kelp and got into a gully and didn't see anything for a little while, and then saw something orange and rusty. And this was a cannonball. And I realized this was just the right size. It was a 9-pounder ball for the cannon that we knew the Royal Anne was carrying. And the Royal Anne is one of the richest wrecks off Cornwall. A lot of gold was found. And this is to be expected on a ship that was carrying so many wealthy men off to Barbados. Those finds really add to the colour and move it a bit beyond archaeology into the excitement of treasure hunting as well. What I think when I look out at Lizard Point is that I've been underwater there and I know what it looks like. I've seen this swept underwater seascape of rock and kelp and wreckage sticking up out of it. And it's exciting and frightening and brings with great vividness to life the final moments of so many of those people who were wrecked against those rocks over the centuries. And so it's like a great book of history.
So next time you're by the sea, look beyond the waves and take a moment to consider the vessels, lives, and stories that lie beneath the surface. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Back When. If you'd like to find out more about the lizard's history, head to the National Trust website. And do follow, rate and review us on your favourite podcast app. If you like the sea, land and stories about people and wildlife, why not check out Wild Tales from National Trust Podcasts? I am sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time. This podcast is sponsored by Seawe, Europe's leading photo printing company. Every image you capture tells a story. Discover ideas for curating and creating your special memories and unique gifts for loved ones. From high-quality, personalised photo books to wall art made from your favourite photos. Head to Seawe, that's cewe.co.uk, and start creating your story.